Well, a 2014 Harris poll involving over 2,000 people found that almost half the respondents indicated that they would rather do any unpleasant activity, like go to the Department of Motor Vehicles, as a for instance, it's a true story, than attend a project, quote, status meeting. Meetings are not favored by all people. Not everyone's a fan of meetings, and actually today we're going to talk directly about that. Kathy Breeze Dobler is an author, and she's a businesswoman. She happens to be a personal friend of ours here at WDCX. She's a believer in Jesus and is from Buffalo, New York, but also a graduate of Kenmore East High School. So there's all the intro you need. Kathy, welcome back to NBL. We're going to talk about how to make meetings not suck. That's actually the name of your book that you co-authored with Jonathan Vihar, or is it Vihar? How do you say that, by the way?
Vihar.
Vihar. Oh, it's none of the above.
Thanks for having me back on, Neil. I'm delighted to be back.
Yeah, well, I think the last time we talked about one of your books, I'm not sure which one it was, but it was probably Ditch the Joneses, Discover Your Family, I'm thinking. Or maybe Ditch the Mainstream, 52 Thought Provokers.
It was Ditch the Mainstream.
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Let's see, 52 Thought Provokers on Discovering a Life of Contentment. And the other one, Ditch the Joneses, was Discover Your Family, How to Thrive on Less Than Two Incomes. Both I highly recommend, by the way. So if you're looking for great reading material, find Kathy Breeze Dobler, spelled Cathibreser, Doebler. I got to spell all your names. Look at that, Kathy Breeze Dobler.
There's a lot of them.
There is. All right. Well, welcome back. And describe what you do for a living, actually. I think it's important that people understand that you didn't just write a book about meetings without having some personal insight on this. So help us understand what you do as a backdrop to what we're going to talk about today.
Sure. I spend most of my time balancing between several different spaces. A lot of time I'm facilitating leadership development programs, and I work with organizations all around the world. And I do that in a couple of capacities, a couple of different organizations I work with. And then I also have my own business where I do that leadership development work as well. And then part of my work is also running meetings or helping people to go through strategic planning or brainstorming or using lots of different creative problem-solving tools. And so luckily for me, very early in my career, I took a course in creative problem solving at Buff State as part of their master's program.
Mm-hmm.
And I also worked for a place called Creative Education Foundation where I got to practice those creative problem solving tools. And it was such a blessing for me because I learned those really early in my career. And I've been able to apply them throughout my career, whether it's a leadership development program or it's a meeting that I'm running. And so I just feel very thankful that I had that very early exposure to those tools.
You know, when you're in the kind of business you're talking about, which in some ways involves, I guess, some consulting, right? You're sitting down with leaders and helping them to hone their skills and whatever. I just want to ask you about that part for 1 second because it seems to me that we live in a world where people are not as teachable as they used to be. I can't prove that, but what I mean is, you know, you go on social media, everybody's an expert. Everyone's got their own blog. They've got their own podcast. They're making statements as though they are the expert on every issue. And it seems to me over the years, as I've done talk radio, that in the old days, 25 years ago, you would get somebody calling in asking for help about a particular problem. Today, people will call in and say, well, I disagree with the expert there. I want you to know my opinion on this. And the reason I'm saying this is because it sounds like your business in many ways is focused on people who are willing to be teachable. Am I overstretching that? Because, I mean, think about it. Like, if you get called in to sit down with a CEO and talk about, how to streamline their business or make meetings more effective, they're entrusting their business model and the way that they work to an expert like you, which I think is encouraging. We need more of that. But am I off base, or do you have to come in and tie the hands of a CEO behind their back and force them to listen to what you have to say? It sounds like this is welcome in the business that you do.
Yeah, and most of the time it is, because the majority of the time it's me being invited in, welcomed in. typically by word of mouth. A client will work with me, recommend me to somebody else. And so that, that gives me some credibility because they're able to say, I worked with her. This was successful. I'd recommend you working with her as well, that kind of thing. So many times I am invited in. But when I'm actually in the classroom with leaders, there is some of that challenge, right, of the expert in the room. And to be honest, a lot of times they are the expert in the room. A lot of the teaching I do is pulling out what a lot of leaders already know and having them often even teach each other. So when I'm facilitating, it's not me standing in front of the classroom and teaching a lot of content. The content does come out and I pull research in when I instruct people, but a lot of what I do is also experiential learning, where people go through experiences and we tie it back to now what do we do to apply this back to work? And so that is a nice way to pull in people's knowledge and gifts and have them even teach each other. And then another really key part to that is to acknowledge to leaders that we're all learning all the time. And that as leaders, a lot of times it's up to us to make the adjustment for the people we lead. Because many times we lead with certain preferences in mind, what we prefer about how to work, how to get through change, how to communicate, how to work in the hybrid environment, the virtual space. And we do that with our own preferences in mind. But if we find out more about our team members and what they need, then we sometimes have to adjust to what they need when we're leading. And we do that by being curious, asking questions, paying attention to the things they ask us. And our curiosity helps us as leaders. So there is a lot of that challenge out there, but some of that organically gets dealt with just by how you lead people or how you lead these sessions that I do.
Well, I think God made me naturally curious, which is why I'm in a business where I ask questions for a living, and I love hearing the answers. I love being taught, but at times have felt a little bit discouraged in the last few years, especially because it just seems like in the social media age and stuff, there's so little, at least expressed willingness to be teachable. And I'm grateful that we have an opportunity to talk about this today because I think a lot of folks, myself included, are going to be able to benefit as we talk about how to make meetings not suck. Which, come on, it's like a great title. I'm sure that there's some people that are like, wait, what? But
right.
where did the title come from?
Well, actually, it was interesting when we were talking about meetings because my colleague and I, we first put something together like this for an organization years ago when we worked together at the Creative Education Foundation. But it was just the basics at that point, and we really wanted to build on what we have learned, what Jonathan and I have learned over the years, and wanted to apply it and make it a much more enhanced resource for people. And as we were talking about it, we were like, what's one of the biggest challenges about meetings? Well, a lot of times things happen in meetings that just literally suck the energy out of the room. And then now you have meetings that are not as productive. And then you have some meetings that just literally suck time out of people's lives because they're not managed well and they're not put together in a way or planned out enough to make them as effective as they could be. And so that word kept coming up. We thought, well, we don't want to just help people have effective meetings. We want to help them make sure those meetings don't suck. So people are willing to go to them. They're willing to spend that time. They're willing to engage in the actual meeting itself. And of course, our subtitle is Tips and Tools to Run Effective Meetings, which is not quite as interesting, but but it gets the point across.
Tips and Tools to Run Effective Meetings. That's the subtitle. The book is called How to Make Meetings Not Suck. Now, we're going to dig into the content of the book after our first break, but one more question before we get there. You're dealing with a lot of like corporate people, CEOs, business people, but I'm thinking that there's a need for this in the not-for-profit world, Christian ministries, churches, right? Because, and especially as a believer, you would understand this, Kathy. I mean, God has allotted each of us a certain amount of time, and we're supposed to use it wisely. And wasting time, spinning our wheels, that's not productive. That's not using that time for the glory of God. So I'm assuming that everything we're going to talk about today would be applicable for really anyone doing anything that involves planning and meetings, right?
Absolutely. has information there that would be helpful for logistics people who are putting meetings together. It's helpful for people at every level of leadership, so it doesn't even have to be the CEOs. In fact, some of the things that are in here are even more applicable to people at the lower levels of leadership because they might be doing some of these practices and tips and tools with their teams. And I have absolutely used these exact tools with nonprofit organizations regularly, and also within churches and within church-affiliated organizations. And so even with my own church, I've had an opportunity to use a lot of these tools in the past with either meetings I've facilitated or meetings I'm helping to co-facilitate with somebody else. And yeah, our time is valuable regardless of whether we're in the workday or whether we're jumping over to church for a meeting in the evening. Either way, we want to respect people's time. And that's actually part of what we get into in our book is it's about respecting people and their time regardless of where we are.
Well, I love that. And we're going to take a break here and then continue the conversation, but we're going to dig into the content. And by God's grace, I mean, we prayed just before we began the interview, but I want to pray here, Lord, help us to be teachable about this idea of meetings and time and how we spend it in leadership and whether or not we're being effective. And I just pray that we would use the very breath you put in our lungs and the time you've allotted to each one of us for your glory, not wasting it, not treating it frivolously, but Lord, cherishing it and using it to productively move ourselves forward in ministry, in business, in whatever capacity to which we've been called. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, let's dig into the contents of a book with probably one of the most interesting titles that I've ever talked about here on NBL, How to Make Meetings Not Suck. Tips and tools to run effective meetings. Kathy, I've had people say to me, literally, they hate meetings. Like, I hate meetings. And maybe it's because some of those meetings sucked. They weren't good. They were sucking the life out of people. They were ineffective. They were time wasters. Who knows why people hate meetings? But this is what you've devoted, the contents of this book to, and help us understand how you attack this thing. Where do we begin to talk about how to make meetings more effective?
What we started to do was we started to think about what are the pain points for people? What is it that they don't like about meetings, like you just said? And so actually, before we started doing any writing, we first did some research. We had research that we pulled from other resources that we include in the book, but we also have research that we did on our own where we surveyed people and asked them questions like, describe the worst meeting you ever went to, or describe the best meeting you ever went to, or what do you like about the meetings you go to, or what do you dislike about those meetings? And so we asked them also about all the different kinds of meetings they experience. Are they in person? Are they virtual? Are they sort of a hybrid mix of the two? Which ones go well, which ones don't? And we took all of that research as well to think about what is it that we can do to help people to be more effective in their meetings. And so when we put the book together, we tried to make it very, very practical and usable and logical as well, just so somebody can easily find what they're looking for. And so we actually broke it into a before meeting section, a during meeting section, and an after meeting section. And in each of those sections, we included concepts, ideas, tips, and then sometimes there's also tools-based right in there. This is a tool you use before a meeting, or this is a tool that you use during the meeting. We have a lot of during the meeting ones, and then after the meeting as well. And so we try to make it so that somebody can plan for that meeting really well, be in the meeting and use the right tool at the right time, and then close down their meeting in a way that doesn't suck. And what I mean by that is making sure that people actually follow through, know who's promised to do what the due date is, all of that follow-through stuff that's so important that often gets dropped after a meeting occurs. So we have all of those pieces interlaced throughout the book.
I want to ask you something about that, but I just want to comment as well. I've been at a lot of meetings over the years that it seemed like an idea was discussed, but no one was ever actually chosen to follow through on any aspect of it. It wasn't like, okay, Fred, you got this and we need it by next week, and Sally, you got that and you're going to have that back to us tomorrow. And, like that there was specific stuff mentioned, a lot of times just generalities. And I don't know, did you see any of that kind of stuff emerge in the questions you were asking folks?
Absolutely. One of the biggest frustrations for people is they've just spent all this time in a meeting. They've contributed ideas. They've spent time working on it, and then they never hear anything later. Or somebody drops the ball and doesn't do something that was talked about in the meeting, but in the meeting, nobody ever said, I'll take ownership of that. I'll do this. And so absolutely, that was one of the pain points for people. And that's why we felt it was so important to include a after section for people. So you know what's key about making sure that the after the meeting is also effective and not just the before and during the meeting.
So, and all of that is discussed during the meeting so that the follow-up can be handled after.
Correct. And there's some tools you can use during the meeting. And then there's also a process. There's processes you can use after the meeting to reinforce that. Simple things like somebody during the meeting is assigned to send those notes out to remind everybody, so everybody gets a copy of it. Or somebody is responsible to put it in a shared space where people can get access to it. So, and then send them a link, things like that. So it's discussion around what are we going to do to make sure everybody has this, and then somebody taking that on as part of the role of their participation in the meeting.
Okay. Well, let's, the way that you talked about it, before, during, and after, let's touch on the before a little bit, because obviously you got to believe the preparation matters, knowing what the meeting's going to be about, being prepared when you get there, and probably not just for the person running the meeting, but the participants as well, I would think.
Absolutely. One of the things that we suggest before the meeting is having an agenda, and if possible, sending it to people ahead of time, because you have different personalities out there of people who, some people love in the moment to just brainstorm, for example, and some people prefer to think a little bit about what is it I'm going to be generating ideas on. And so if you can create an agenda ahead of time and let people know this is what we're going to be talking about, come prepared for these things, it helps them to come to the meeting and also not suck time out of the meeting by saying, what are we here for? Why are we in this meeting? Right? So there's things you can do ahead of that meeting to prepare people for the meeting itself, to help it to be a much more effective meeting. And we actually put together something called a power agenda. Mm-hmm. And the power agenda includes a lot of the things that you track during the meeting, but also give people as a guide of here's how this meeting is going to go. Here's how much time we'll spend on this topic. Here's who's going to be in charge of that topic. Here's the one who owns the topic, basically. And so there's different pieces of that power agenda that are really important. That is a part of before the meeting, and then you also use it during the meeting.
It just sounds so much more organized than most of the meetings I've been in my life in a variety of different settings, because I've worked in Christian ministries. I served as a pastor. I've worked in Christian radio for many years, and have also sat in on meetings with other organizations like our advertising partners and that kind of stuff. So you see a lot of this stuff playing out, and all I can say is there's a desperate need to make meetings better. That's for sure. And I want to highly recommend the book, How to Make Meetings Not Suck: Tips and Tools to Run Effective Meetings, from Jonathan Vihar and Kathy Breeze-Dobler. All right, so, okay, but quick question about the before. That is, if you're planning a meeting in advance, like if you say, okay, next week, we're going to all meet, and we're going to talk about this topic, and here's the power agenda. Here's who's going to be in charge of talking about this, that, or the other thing, and we're going to spend X amount of time on this, and then we're going to move along to that, so that people clearly know where this thing's going. But some meetings are by necessity impromptu, like, hey,
sure.
We just lost our biggest client, or our CEO just resigned, that kind of thing. So does this apply for impromptu meetings as well as planned?
Absolutely. There's a sample power agenda that we put in our book that shows people all the pieces to include. But there's also in the moment where you can use some of those exact same things. You can have a conversation with the group right up front about, number one, why are we here? What is this meeting about? So making people aware of the purpose right off the bat. And then you can also ask people to take certain roles in the meeting if you need them. So if you need somebody, for example, to capture what's being done so that people can see it up in front of them, like maybe it's a hybrid meeting where you're sharing electronically and you want somebody to have some sort of screen up. So as people are discussing things, that text is being written. Ask, who can be our scribe right now? Could you get your computer up and start sharing your screen? So you get that role definition of who's going to do what during this meeting, you can do that right in the moment. It's ideal if you're able to have that done ahead of time, but like you said, reality is sometimes there's those last minute meetings. And so explaining the purpose of the meeting to everybody up front is the key. Another is making sure that you give out any roles that you need. If you have a scribe, if you have somebody who's got to be a decision maker on something, this person, for example, is going to be our decision maker about this, but for a while we're going to do some discussion around ideas, and then we're ultimately going to let this person make the decision. So let them know what's the goal of the meeting as well.
Yeah.
So you can do those things right in the moment as well.
What about during the meeting, like meeting disruptors? What about the guy who just rambles on and then starts talking about what he did last weekend? It has nothing to do with the meeting. I mean, of course, that's maybe an extreme example in certain circumstances, but but maybe not, because I've been in those kind of meetings too. I mean, do you have tips about how to keep the meeting in line, in control, in other words?
Well, there's two things that could be going on there. So the first thing that could be happening is it could be that group needs some time for connection before driving into here's what we're going to try to do action-wise in this meeting. Mm-hmm. And so if it's a group that really doesn't need that connection, build some of that time into that meeting. So you can actually build in, we don't call them icebreakers. In fact, we talk about that in the book, but they're basically ways to connect people. And because when you use the word icebreaker, sometimes there's about half the room that is excited because you've just said the word icebreaker and they're ready to do something together. And then there's the other half of the room where there's this chill going down their spine.
Yeah. They're crawling over each other to get to the door. Yeah.
But the concept behind an icebreaker is just simply connection. And so that's one of the kinds of meetings we talk about in our book. And so that's one of the things is think about, is the reason this person is sharing right now is because they're feeling a need to be connected? Do we need to do a little bit of that? Even if it's just a simple exercise that we do that takes 4 minutes at the very beginning of the meeting just to set that tone. And then the other thing you can do is during the meeting, if you've got somebody who's derailing, there's some different, this person's derailing the conversation for the group. There's different tools you can use. We talk about several of them in our during the meeting chapter. One of them is called a parking lot, which is a space where, and you explain the parking lot right up front. And it's a place where you can put side issues up, things that we can't deal with in this meeting, but they are important and we don't want to forget about them. You capture them in a parking lot, and then you make sure at the end of the meeting you come back to the parking lot to see if there's any issues that need to be addressed and taken forward. Somebody needs to own those. So that's one tool. Another tool is a concept that's different from brainstorming, and it's called brain writing. And there's a very specific way to have people come up with ideas in written format. And that helps to manage when you've got somebody who's always speaking over the others. And then there's several other tools as well. But those are the first two that come to mind for me for managing the person or one or two people who always are speaking up. And you want to make sure that you hear from everybody.
You know, my wife, Mary, has been a registered nurse for many years and has served in a variety of different capacities in pediatrics and in OBGYN and all that stuff, and eventually ended up at Compass Care, which is a pro-life pregnancy center. And you know, she's basically, quote, retired, but still works there 2 days a week. At some point, they made her head nurse. I shouldn't be talking about her on the radio in case she's listening to, but Mary is very efficient, and she makes good use of her time in so many different ways. She can do the laundry and do baking and clean the house and write thank you notes. And I mean, it's unbelievable what Mary can do in a normal context, but she's never run a meeting before in that sense because she was never the head nurse. So she's been, looking at different ways, different tools. She's going to really appreciate reading this book, I think. But I'm thinking about not just the established leader, in other words, but people that have been put in charge of something and they've never really run it before. Could this be as much for the beginner as the person that's been in business for 25 years?
Yes, for sure, because there's tools in the book that are those first level tools. For example, the agenda concept has been out there for a long time, but not everybody understands what to include in an agenda. So that's where the power agenda comes from. It's sort of a basic, this is something that people should already understand, but it just doesn't happen innately. So that kind of a basic tool, that's why we made sure there's a copy of it so they can see exactly what it should look like in general. But then there's also some tools in there that are a little more advanced. And so the person out there who's been running meetings for a while, but they're noticing that maybe they're not using the right tools or not using the right process to get what they need, they would get a lot as well out of this, because there's tools in there that they might never have used before that would apply for their situation. So for example, there's a more advanced tool called, I would call it more advanced, just as far as what the facilitator role it requires and how you have to think about it mindset-wise. Mm-hmm. And it's called the ladder of abstraction. And it's one of those tools that when you have a group that's bringing up an issue, but it doesn't seem like they can figure out what the real issue is, because you don't want to problem solve until you know what the true issue is, mm-hmm. or else you're wasting time, right? So this ladder of abstraction tool is a way for a group to spend time figuring out what is the actual issue we're working on. And it's a very cool process that takes people up the ladder and down the ladder with certain kinds of question process. And if you use that, it will help you to narrow down what is it we actually want to work on. I actually use that with a Christian organization probably, I'm trying to think about when I just used that within the last year or so with this Christian organization, and they had that struggle. It was almost like they were just hovering around in this cloud of decision making, and it was because they didn't know what the real issue was. So we used that ladder of abstraction tool, and then we used another tool mentioned in the book called highlighting to help them to decide which ones they felt were most effective for them to work on. Mm-hmm. And we were able to narrow that meeting down into a place that was much more effective than where they had been without me in the room facilitating. But I'm an experienced facilitator, so that's a tool that's a little higher level. It might be something that the first time you run a meeting, that might not be the tool to choose. But maybe some of the other ones will absolutely be the ones to choose. And I think you can tell when you're reading it. Based on when you're reading it, you can think, oh, I could do this. I feel like this makes tons of sense to me.
Yeah, and it's pretty obvious listening to you talk that you're comfortable using these tools, that this is what you do, this is what you are familiar with. Do you have a favorite? Is there something in your tool bag that's like your go-to or your favorite?
I do. Well, one of them is the ladder of abstraction, because I don't get to use it very often. It's not a tool that's I would call it the most rare, okay. The ladder of abstraction tool.
Yeah.
But another one that I love using, and it's partly because of how I work and how my brain functions. I'm a process person, so as soon as somebody says something, I'm often processing the how to get it done. And there's a tool called the card sort, and the card sort really helps when you've got all these different tasks that you know that have to happen in a project, and it's almost like your brain is overwhelmed by all these tasks. It's a way to prioritize those tasks and then make decisions better having prioritized them. And so when you've got a group where you're doing maybe some brainstorming, for example, and you're brainstorming a list of all the tasks that have to occur, this card sort process helps you to slowly take all of those things and put them into a manageable order. Whereas before they felt like they were just covering the whole wall mm-hmm. of the room. Now you can use this tool to break them down into tiny pieces and make it much more palatable for people to look at.
Sure. Yeah, and by lining them up in that sense, by putting them in some sequential order or preferred order, you're creating a path, really, instead of just a wall full of stuff. You're creating a path right. to move along, more or less.
Yeah. It's also a tool that can be used with one-on-one conversations. So if you've got somebody, for example, I've done it this way where I have somebody who's considering a job offer. Maybe they've got a couple of job offers and they're trying to decide which one they would be the best fit. Mm-hmm. You can use the card sort to come up with your list of things that you want to prioritize. And then you can use another tool in our book called the decision-making matrix, and an evaluation matrix, and it helps you to evaluate those ideas and make the best decision for you.
Kathy Breeze Dobler, she's a friend, and we've had her on a number of times. She's author of several books. One was called Ditch the Joneses, Discover Your Family, How to Thrive on Less Than 2 Incomes. It was about streamlining your life in order to be able to have more time for your family. It was a fabulous book called Ditch the Joneses. And then co-wrote Ditch the Mainstream, 52 Thought Provokers on Discovering a Life of Contentment. And that she co-wrote with her sister, Sandra Breeze Sandra Breeze Rice. And we had that conversation in studio here at WDCX a number of years ago. Well, this one's called How to Make Meetings Not Suck, Tips and Tools to Run Effective Meetings, co-authored with Jonathan Vihar. But Kathy, you've got a real handle on this stuff. I can hear it in your voice just as you talk, but I should have assumed that, given that you're a Kenmore East High School graduate like myself. You know, it just goes with the territory, right? I mean,
that's right.
Come on. Yeah. So I want to ask you then about the digital world. We got to get to this because this is where we live. Zoom meetings, people not all working in the office at the same time, the whole work from home thing. This has to have an impact. So how do you factor that in?
Right. Well, we've got different kinds of teams happening now than were pre-pandemic world, right? So there were people who were leading virtual teams before that, but now that is happening at a much higher rate. And so there's a lot of variety now in the kinds of meetings people have to run, whether they're in-person meetings and everybody's all in that room together, or they're completely virtual meetings where everybody is online and viewing a screen together, or there's those hybrid meetings where you've got some of the people who are in a meeting together and some of them who are dialing in by phone or by computer and trying to participate along with the in-person people. And each of them has their own special challenges, and each of them is happening at a regular rate now. Whereas in the past, it almost always was that in-person feel that people associated with meetings, not so much the case today. And when we did our research on this book, we did ask people about their experiences with those three different kinds of meetings and what kinds of challenges they ran into. It's interesting, though, regardless of the kind of meeting, there are certain principles that just go across the board. So what we tried to do in our book is, first of all, we acknowledge the kinds of meetings, but we also remind people that you just have to be creative about how to use these tools depending on what kind of environment you're doing them in.
Which is helpful. What about, like, I'm sure you've heard of it, but stand-up meetings, you know, like where the meeting lasts 5 minutes, everyone stands. I don't know what the purpose of that essentially is, but I've been a part of a few of them, and they seem to be more targeted, I guess I would say, because there was more of a time crunch. Hey, we're here to make a decision. We're here to get a few things done and decide where we need to go from here. And I kind of like that aspect, but I don't know. Do those work, or is that just a trendy tool that somebody thought would be good and it really isn't?
Right. The format of a meeting, it works depending on the situation. So those stand-up meetings, the purpose of them really is to keep them quick because people are there and they're ready to move and they're ready to go somewhere else, and standing around after a while can get irritating, right? So,
right.
But they're pretty much effective if you're doing the quick impromptu meetings. You know you need some quick information from the group, or you're doing a quick pulse check with the group, or maybe you're giving them some general information that you need them all to have right at that moment. And so you gather everybody together to give them that quick information, and then maybe the meeting is one of those ones where you don't have all the details yet, but you want to at least make them aware that something's coming. But there's different kinds of meetings. There's those kinds of meetings. There's the ones that you have maybe daily. Sometimes there's meetings that happen weekly. Certain meetings might happen on a monthly basis. Some are quarterly. Each of them has their time and place, and certain kinds of things make sense being discussed at certain types of times. So you're not going to, for example, say you're going to have a strategic planning session where it's going to be very time intensive. You need lots of feedback from people. You're going to be making some very large decisions about the future of your organization. That's more likely to happen in one of those quarterly meetings, right? Or biannual meetings where you're setting aside a large chunk of the day or a couple of days to do strategic planning. Mm-hmm. But if you're just going to tell a group about some new process that's coming in and you want them all to know, I don't have all the details yet, but I want you to be aware this is coming and I'm going to know more by the end of the day. That's one of those quick daily meetings where you inform the group quickly and then you let them know it's coming so they're not feeling thrown when you finally get it at the end of the day. And then you pull them aside when you have that information they need.
I mentioned earlier that I was wondering if this information really is just for the corporate world, and business, or if it could work in ministries and organizations. And you said obviously this can work across the board, but I'm not sure that most ministries really, how do I say this, are thinking this way. Sometimes you get into a meeting, somebody starts in a church kind of setting, and you start talking about maybe plans for what we're going to do this summer for Vacation Bible School or something. And so, there's that type of feel to it. It's a bit of a strategic meeting, but, you're kind of looking to the future, and somebody says, oh, by the way, did you hear that so-and-so accepted Christ, or that, somebody was placed in the hospital and we're going to need to reach out. So there's some extraneous piece of information. And then as Christians, you feel like the ministry need to kind of gather around, pray, whatever. And some of those things are really necessary, and they can be good, but they can also be distractors that pull you off topic. And so I'm wondering, can this really work in a church setting? And I'm hopeful that it can, but I just wondered what you had to say about it, because I would think you're kind of familiar with both worlds.
I am, and absolutely. In the church world, what you're going to find is maybe more of a tendency for people to have that desire for connection because of the kind of environment they're within. So it's not that people everywhere don't want to be connected. They do. It's just that when you're in the church world, there is this assumption that we're all here for each other as well, to support each other. Mm-hmm. Versus if you walk into a meeting in a business environment, that's not always the case. Sometimes people are not coming in the room feeling that way about their colleagues. So it's great if they do, but they're not always feeling that way.
You worked you worked at one of those places too? Okay, go ahead.
For sure, I think we all have.
Yeah.
So I think that's the key thing too, is to remember when we get into a church meeting, a lot of times that connection piece is so important. So setting that time ahead at the beginning is key. And it could be as simple as the person who's leading the meeting saying, is there anything major going on or anything important going on that we all need to be aware of for our prayer time today? And maybe you start off the meeting with a prayer, or you end the meeting with a prayer, or you do both. But either way, give them a time to voice those things right at the beginning, and then say, let's make it part of our prayer. And now here's what we need to talk about. And then you move into the agenda for the time. And if it comes up again, this is where that parking lot is so wonderful. If you say, we have a parking lot, we're going to put it over here. If anything else comes up that doesn't deal with the topic at hand, we're going to throw it up there on the parking lot. Then when you get to the end of that meeting, you have two opportunities in a church setting. Number one is to go back to that parking lot and acknowledge those things and see if there's anybody who wants to carry them forward and who's going to take responsibility for that. And then you also can pray about whatever's on that parking lot that might be on people's minds. Mm-hmm. So you can do that in a church setting where that would not necessarily happen, that wouldn't happen in a for-profit organization typically.
Well, we're going to have to wrap this up here, but I want you to speak from your heart, Kathy, and talk to those who are listening, because there's a lot of people in leadership roles. Some are, chief executive officers of organizations. Others are in middle management, or a pastor or a ministry leader, whatever. And we know that the time God has entrusted to us is precious, and we don't want to waste it. We want to be efficient and utilize, whatever tools are available for God's glory, so that quality decisions can be made and decisions can be made, whatever. But I want you to just speak from your heart. Take the floor for a minute here. Help us understand why you wrote the book again, and then invite people to get a copy, because I want people to get a copy of this book.
Thank you. Well, Jonathan Vihar and I, when we wrote this book, one of the things that kept coming up for us when we were doing our initial brainstorming was how important it is to respect each other's time. And so the word respect comes up over and over again. And the reason it's so important is, regardless of whether or not you are running a church meeting or a business meeting, ultimately, when you value people's time, you are respecting them. Mm-hmm. So we saw that very important connection, and we wanted to make sure that we gave people access to all the possible tools that you could use to be more respectful of people's time. And so now the book's not just going to make somebody run a meeting better, but reading the book and applying the tools that make sense are the ones that help people run those meetings better. And when we run meetings more effectively, we take less of people's time, or the time that we're taking feels more valuable to them, and they therefore feel more respected. And so our hope was to make it such a practical book, a book that people could apply today. Like as soon as they read it, they think, I can do this. This is something I can manage and make changes to. And we found that's been the response. For people who do go and visit on Amazon, and they're one of those people who wants to read book reviews, there's review after review up there. We have a lot of reviews up there already about how practical and easy it is. And a lot of people talk about the appendix where we relist some of the tools, and you can find them very easily. And so that was our goal. Our goal was to help people to respect others by running meetings that either take less of their time or at least make the time more valuable for them to be there.
Yeah, that don't suck valuable time out of your schedule or suck energy out of your team. And for those reasons, we all need to know how to make meetings not suck. Tips and tools to run effective meetings from Jonathan Vihar and Kathy Breeze Dobler. And Lord, I just pray for the success of this book and that it would be used for your glory for all of the reasons Kathy just described. That, Lord, we'd be efficient in how we manage ourselves in the workplace and in ministry, and that whatever we do would be done for your glory, Lord God. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. Well, Kathy, thank you so much for spending time with us. You're welcome anytime here on WDCX, and next time let's do it in studio. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.